A desperate father races into a busy Houston garage, begging for an urgent fix to reach his injured daughter in the hospital. The rest of the shop turned their backs. But a 20-year-old black mechanic stepped forward. For that act of compassion, he was instantly fired. What this young mechanic didn't realize is that the man he helped was the CEO's own brother. What happens next will shock everyone. Before we dive in, let us know where you're watching from. The morning rush buzzed like a well-oiled machine. Cars jammed the street outside, horns blaring, construction humming from nearby buildings. Inside, fluorescent lights flickered over rows of steel tool chests and cars hoisted midair. The air smelled of gasoline, old rubber, and burnt coffee. Mechanics moved lazily, laughing over crude jokes and sipping from oversized mugs. But not Elijah. At just 20, Elijah stood out. Not only because of his youth, but because he worked like his life depended on it. Deep brown skin, close-cropped hair, arms defined from years of turning wrenches. He wore a grease-streaked navy jumpsuit with his name embroidered over the chest. Sweat clung to his temples, even in the morning chill, while others chatted and checked their phones. Elijah was on his back under a '22 Ford Explorer, fixing a bent axle without a word. People noticed him, but not the way he deserved. "Hey, someone tell Junior to grab my wrench. Chop chop, rookie." One of the senior techs barked, tossing a rag in Elijah's direction. Another chimed in with a smirk. "He's good with his hands. Comes from a long line of folks who did manual labor, if you know what I mean." Laughter erupted. No one flinched. Elijah clenched his jaw, rolled out from under the vehicle, and walked to the tool wall in silence. This wasn't the first comment. It wouldn't be the last. Every day, subtle jabs about his skin, his age, where he was from. The manager, Mr. Davis, didn't say much unless Elijah missed a deadline. Then he was right there, raising his voice, calling him kid, in front of customers. Still, Elijah kept going, not because he liked the treatment, but because he had no choice. His mom worked night shifts at a nearby hospital. Bills didn't pay themselves. He had dreams, big ones. Maybe one day run his own garage, hire guys like himself. But dreams didn't mean much here. Not when you're young, not when you're black. This garage ran on hierarchy, unspoken rules. And in that system, Elijah was always at the bottom. Not because he lacked skills. He was probably the sharpest tech in the shop. But every time he stepped up, someone stepped on him. Every time he spoke out, he got a warning. So Elijah worked quietly, determinedly, watching, waiting, and he had no idea that today, the day that started like any other, was going to change everything. It was nearly 10:30 a.m. when the shop door creaked open again. The chime above it let out a weak ding, drowned by the buzz of an impact wrench in the back. No one turned to look, no one cared, but Elijah noticed. From beneath the raised hood of a Dodge, he caught a glimpse. A man stepping inside with worn shoes, a faded jacket that looked like part of a uniform, and eyes darting anxiously. He looked out of place, not because of a menacing appearance, but because of the desperate way he moved, fast but careful, like a man searching for something or trying not to break. The man's face was flushed, his eyes darting across the room, scanning every mechanic, every desk. His breathing was fast and shallow, but not angry, more like panicked. The word taxi, faintly visible on the back of his jacket, drew quiet, judging glances from the corner of the room. A few customers near the waiting area shifted uncomfortably. One of them, a man in a suit holding a coffee, leaned to his wife and whispered, "Jesus, what's he doing here?" The driver stepped up to the counter and spoke quick, breathless. "Car died just outside. I need help. My daughter, she had an accident. She's in the ER uptown. I need to get there fast." His voice cracked, not with aggression, but desperation. "Please just need a jump or a fix. Whatever gets me out of here." The receptionist, a woman named Brenda, with nails long enough to tap her phone while she typed, didn't even lift her eyes. "Take a seat," she said flatly. "I really don't have time to wait, sir. Everyone here's got somewhere to be." She snapped back. Behind him, two guys in line rolled their eyes. Should have called an Uber, one muttered. Another customer actually stood and started walking toward the door. I don't feel comfortable with him here. Look at him, pacing like that, making a scene. The driver turned slightly, as if realizing for the first time he wasn't just being ignored. He was being rejected, labeled a nuisance. He stepped away from the counter, rubbing his hand over his face, glancing back toward the street like he was deciding whether to run or shout or cry. He took a step toward the door, defeated, fishing his phone from his pocket to call a cab, when a voice cut through the hum of judgment. Hey, wait up! The driver turned. Elijah was standing beside the workbench, holding a bottle of water in one hand and wiping his hands on a rag with the other. What kind of car? Elijah asked, calm like it was just another job. A sedan, a Crown Vic. Something's off with the engine. Won't start. I parked it right out front. Cool. Mind if I take a look? Elijah walked toward him without waiting for an answer and offered the water. You look like hell, man? The driver blinked, hesitated, then took the bottle. Thanks. Yeah, my kid. She took a fall. Internal bleeding or something. The hospital's all the way across town. Elijah crouched by the car parked just outside the bay door, eyes scanning quickly. I can take a shot at it. Might be something simple. You got time to wait? Like 10 minutes. 10 minutes I'll take, the man said, almost whispering. From behind them, a sarcastic voice rang out. Look at Elijah playing captain. Save a taxi driver. Elijah didn't turn, didn't answer. He just reached into his toolbox, methodical, and got to work. But inside, his heart thumped, not from fear, but from the weight of everything around him. He knew exactly what was happening. The glares, the whispers, the distance people kept. It was familiar, too familiar. He had lived it since he was old enough to be followed through a store or asked if he really worked here. He wasn't helping this man because he pitied him. He was helping because he understood him. But while Elijah worked, the tension thickened. The driver stayed near, watching. Even in his panic, he kept checking over his shoulder, wary of being asked to leave again. The other techs ignored them now, but the air was thick with judgment, like a fuse waiting to light. Then came the footsteps, heavy, sharp. Mr. Davis, the shop manager, late 40s, shaved head, and a permanent scowl. He spotted the driver, then Elijah, then the tools on the ground. His face tightened. What the hell is this? Elijah stood slowly, just helping him out. Quick fix his. I didn't ask for an essay, Elijah. Who told you to work on that car? No one. But the guy needs. Davis stepped closer, his voice dropping. He's not a customer. Not officially. You don't work on anything without a ticket. You know that. The driver spoke, hesitant. I'll pay whatever. I'm not asking for free. Davis spun toward him. I don't care if you're offering a blank check. This is a professional establishment. We don't do favors for people who walk in off the street looking like a distraction. Elijah blinked. That word, distraction, like it was stamped on a forehead. He stepped forward, his voice low but solid. He's not causing a distraction. He's trying to get to his daughter. If this were someone else... Enough! Davis pointed toward the door. Back to your bay now. The driver stepped back, ready to go. Look, I didn't mean to cause trouble. I'll find another way. Elijah didn't move. He looked at Davis, then at the people watching from the corners, the ones who wouldn't help, who wouldn't even offer a minute of their day. You're really going to let this man walk out when you've got 10 mechanics standing around sipping coffee? Mr. Davis, I've done double shifts, taken the worst jobs. You told me hard work would get me somewhere here, and the one time I helped someone without asking for anything, you're ready to throw me out. Davis's eyes narrowed, his lip curled. Pack your tools. You're done. Silence. Elijah didn't argue. He just stared back. Not with shock, but something colder. Acceptance. The driver looked down, muttered, I'm sorry, kid. Elijah shook his head. Don't be. It's not your fault they don't see you or me. The driver hesitated, then reached out his hand. Elijah took it, a brief, solid grip, a shared understanding, And just like that, the man in the worn jacket walked out the door. Elijah stood alone in the center of a room full of people, yet somehow still invisible. The garage returned to its rhythm with an eerie ease after the driver left, like a rock had been dropped into a pond, and the surface smoothed itself over too quickly. Elijah stood motionless for a moment, the sting of the manager's words still raw in his ears. Around him, tools clinked and tires hissed with compressed air. No one said anything to him. No pats on the back, no defense, just silence, and the unspoken agreement that he had crossed a line by standing up for a man like that. He wiped his hands on his jumpsuit absently, walking back toward his workbench like a man who hadn't just been fired, but who still had things to finish. The tools were still laid out. The dodge he'd been working on still waited. And yet everything felt different now. The act was done. The choice had been made. From behind, one of the techs muttered just loud enough for Elijah to hear. All that for some desperate cabbie. Wasn't worth it, bro. Elijah didn't answer. His hands were steady, but his chest burned. Not with regret. No, that wasn't it. It was the knowing, the hard truth that it didn't matter how many hours he put in, how many busted axles he fixed, or how many times he smiled through gritted teeth. He would always be the first one out the door. Always the easiest to blame. He had spent 2 years pretending that keeping his head down would earn him respect. But respect, he now realized, was never being offered. He heard the manager in the back office, his voice sharp and dismissive, probably on the phone with corporate or maybe bragging to a friend about how he handled the situation. Elijah could see it all in his mind. The smirk, the self-satisfaction, the complete lack of understanding about what had really happened. He kept working not out of stubbornness, but out of instinct. One bolt, then another. His hands moved on muscle memory, but his thoughts drifted. He pictured the driver on the sidewalk, fumbling for his phone, hoping a cab would come in time. He imagined the man's daughter alone in a hospital bed, the minutes ticking by like hours. That man had walked into a room full of people and been treated like a problem. And for what? A worn jacket, a desperate plea, the wrong kind of urgency. Elijah had seen that look in other people's eyes before. The kind that said, "You're not one of us. You don't belong here." He had grown up watching his mom get talked over at grocery stores, watching teachers dismiss him without cause, cops slow roll past him when he walked home late from work. And now here it was again. But this time someone else had been on the receiving end. Someone who on paper should have never had anything in common with Elijah, and yet they had everything in common in that moment. "Yo," Brenda called from the desk. "You going to stand there all day? Davis said you're out." Elijah looked up, and for a second he wanted to say something, to challenge the system, to scream. But what would it change? These people had already made up their minds. So instead he nodded once calmly and returned to the back to grab his things. The locker room smelled like old sweat and rubber. Elijah opened his locker slowly, the hinges squealing like they hadn't been greased in years. He tossed his gloves inside, unzipped his jumpsuit halfway, and took a long breath. He wasn't angry, not in the way they expected, not in a way that could be solved with shouting or fists. He felt something deeper, a clean kind of clarity. Because in that moment, losing his job for helping someone, he finally felt like himself, like he'd done something that mattered, even if no one else could see it. As he pulled on his hoodie and started packing his tools, the door creaked open behind him. It was Caleb, one of the newer techs, barely a year in, barely spoke. "Hey," Caleb mumbled. "That was something back there." Elijah gave him a look. Not sharp, just tired. "Yeah." Caleb scratched at the back of his neck. "I mean, I don't know. That guy did look pretty frantic, but he seemed real. Most of the guys wouldn't even given him a second look. Just saying." Elijah closed his toolbox with a click. "Yeah, that's the problem." He walked past Caleb without another word, his boots echoing down the hallway. Each step felt heavier, like he was carrying not just a bag of tools, but the weight of every time he'd been forced to swallow his pride. As he reached the main bay again, he paused. The shop floor was just as it had been. Machines humming, men talking, oil streaking across the concrete. A world that had decided he didn't belong. Davis stood by the counter, clipboard in hand, pretending not to notice Elijah, but his jaw was tight. His eyes flicked up just long enough to say, "Don't say anything more." Elijah didn't. He simply walked to the front door, pushed it open, and stepped outside into the cold air. And there standing at the edge of the curb was the driver, Calvin. He hadn't left. Elijah blinked, surprised. "Thought you'd be at the hospital by now." The man nodded. "I was. Just came back." He paused. "She's stable. Got there in time thanks to you." Elijah looked at him, searching. "Why come back?" The driver's eyes were tired but clear. "Because I've been where you are. Because nobody should have to pay that kind of price for doing the right thing." Elijah didn't know what to say, so he said nothing. The driver held out his hand again, firmer this time. Elijah shook it. "Name's Calvin." "Elijah." Calvin gave a faint smile. "Well, Elijah, you ever need a job or anything? Find me." And with that, Calvin turned and walked off into the city traffic, swallowed by taxis and sirens and steel. Elijah stood there for a long moment, letting the cold air fill his lungs. He didn't know what would happen next. No job, no plan. But something had shifted. For the first time in a long time, Elijah felt like he hadn't just survived the day. He had chosen who he wanted to be, and that made all the difference. The next morning, the city woke up in the same rhythm it always did. Sirens echoing off buildings, steam rising from subway grates, cabs honking impatiently. Elijah stood at a corner near the familiar glass and concrete shell of the garage. The shop looked the same as it had every morning for the last 2 years, like nothing had happened, like he hadn't been cut loose less than 24 hours ago for daring to show a stranger kindness. His duffel bag hung heavy on his shoulder, packed with the essentials. Wrenches, torque gauge, a socket set his uncle gave him when he first landed the job. Tools that had become an extension of him. He didn't really know why he'd come back this morning. Maybe to pick up the rest of his stuff, maybe to say goodbye, maybe just to see it one last time before moving on. But standing there watching the sun catch the oil-slick shimmer of the pavement, he felt like he was looking through glass at a world he wasn't allowed in anymore. He pushed the door open quietly, half expecting someone to shout at him, tell him he didn't belong here, but the room barely noticed him. Brenda was typing behind the desk, chewing gum so loud it popped between every few words of her phone call. The techs were back at their stations, heads down, same banter echoing off the walls, like yesterday had been erased, like his voice had never risen, like his choice had never been made. He made his way toward the back hallway. No one stopped him. No one even looked up. The locker room was cold and dim, and the same flickering light overhead buzzed with the same tired whine. Elijah crouched and opened his locker. The rest of his tools were there, neatly lined in foam trays he had cut himself to fit. He ran his fingers across the metal edges. Each piece had a memory. Tight spots, long nights, that one afternoon when he rebuilt an entire alternator because the replacement hadn't arrived. He started packing slowly. Outside the door, someone laughed. Then another voice answered with something about new rules and cleaning up the place. Elijah's shoulders tensed. He knew that tone. They weren't talking about the floor. He zipped the bag shut and sat on the bench for a minute longer than necessary. The weight of everything hit a little harder in that small, quiet space. This place had been more than a job. It had been the promise of something more. Stability, respect, a future, and now it was gone because he couldn't keep his mouth shut. Because he'd helped someone who didn't look right. And yet he didn't feel regret, just a raw ache of something heavier. The door creaked. Footsteps entered. He didn't look up. "You here to cause more drama, Davis?" His voice was smug, but not loud, almost cautious. Elijah stood, slung the duffel over his shoulder. "Just picking up my things, right?" Davis crossed his arms. "You could have had a solid future here, kid, if you just learned to follow protocol. You think acting like some social justice hero earns you something? I wasn't trying to be a hero." Elijah's voice was calm, but there was steel beneath it. "I was trying to be human." Davis scoffed. "You millennials think respect is handed out like candy. Newsflash. Nobody gives a damn how good your heart is if you can't follow orders. I followed every order for 2 years, Elijah said, stepping forward. I worked harder than anyone in this place. I stayed quiet. I took the jokes, and you still saw me as disposable. Davis opened his mouth, but Elijah walked past him, not waiting for the argument. There was nothing left to say. As he pushed back into the main shop floor, a few heads turned this time, just for a second, just long enough to acknowledge his presence, or maybe his absence. Brenda looked up as he passed the counter. You forget something? No, Elijah replied, adjusting his bag. Just needed to see it one last time. The bell above the door jingled softly as he stepped out into the crisp morning. The city moved around him without pause. People rushing past, clutching coffee cups, barking into phones. Everyone was busy being someone. He walked for blocks with no clear destination, past construction zones, delis, and dry cleaners, past corners he and his mom used to wait at when she had just started working nights and he was still in high school, too scared to sleep until she got home. His feet eventually carried him to a park bench across from the hospital where Calvin had said his daughter was. He didn't even know why. Maybe he wanted to make sure the man had made it. Maybe he needed to anchor yesterday in something real. He sat there, elbows on knees, watching taxis unload patients, doctors and scrubs sipping energy drinks, parents juggling bags in fear. His phone buzzed once in his pocket. He pulled it out. A message from Caleb read, "They moved someone else into your bay, just so you know." Elijah didn't answer. He powered the phone down and slid it back into his pocket. He leaned back, letting the sun find his face, and breathed. The day was colder than he liked, but for the first time in a long while he didn't feel small. He felt free, untethered. It was terrifying, but it was honest. Somewhere deep inside, a quiet pride stirred, because in a world that often rewarded cruelty, he had chosen compassion. And even if no one had applauded, even if it cost him his paycheck, his schedule, the rhythm of his life, he had done what he knew was right, and that was worth something. Maybe not to the world, but to himself, and for now, that was enough. By late afternoon, Elijah had made peace with the idea that this chapter of his life was over. He hadn't found clarity sitting on that park bench, but something had settled inside him, a steadiness, maybe even a sense of relief. He hadn't just walked out of that garage yesterday. He'd walked away from a version of himself that had been trying too hard to fit into a space that never wanted him in the first place. Still, endings never came without their weight. As he walked home with his duffel bag tugging at his shoulder, his mind ran through the same questions over and over. What now? Where to go next? Who would take a chance on a 20-year-old black mechanic who got fired for talking back? When he reached his apartment building in Houston, a narrow 5-story walk-up with peeling paint and creaky stairs, he expected to disappear into a long night of searching job boards and eating leftovers with his mom. But instead he found a note taped to his door. His name was scrolled in black marker and the handwriting was rushed but neat. It read, "Come back to the shop right now, CEO." Elijah stared at it for a moment, half convinced it was a joke. But it wasn't the kind of prank his neighbors would pull, and no one at the garage had that kind of handwriting. His gut tightened, part curiosity, part apprehension. He hesitated just long enough to change his shirt, then grabbed his keys and headed back out, heart thudding with something that felt dangerously close to hope. The sun was dipping below the skyline by the time he reached the garage. From the outside, everything looked as normal as it had that morning. But inside, something had shifted. The lobby lights were brighter, and the energy had changed, quieter, tenser. Mechanics weren't lounging or laughing. They stood clustered near the entrance to the office hallway, whispering in tight circles, eyes darting like they were waiting for something big to drop. Before Elijah could ask, the double doors to the conference room opened and a voice called out, firm and direct, "Elijah Brown, come in." He recognized the voice. Mr. Sterling, the CEO of the entire garage chain. He'd seen him twice before, both times from a distance during site visits when the whole shop was polished up like a showroom. Sterling was a tall, composed man in his 50s, always in pressed slacks, and leather shoes that never seemed to touch dust. But today he wasn't wearing a suit. Today he was in jeans, sleeves rolled, and his face looked like someone who hadn't slept. Elijah stepped inside. The room smelled of coffee and tension. At the far end of the table stood Calvin, the taxi driver, his worn jacket hanging off the back of a chair, arms crossed, expression unreadable. Elijah froze, unsure what this meant. But Calvin gave a faint nod. Not a smile, just a gesture that said, "You're good. I got you." Sterling gestured for Elijah to take a seat. "You've had quite a week, I hear." Elijah sat slowly, his voice cautious. "Didn't expect to be back." Sterling leaned forward, clasping his hands on the table. "Yesterday, a man walked into one of my shops, and most of my staff treated him like a nuisance, a distraction. They judged him on how he looked, not why he was there. He asked for help and he was ignored. Worse than ignored. He was dismissed." Calvin's voice came in low and clear. "Except by him." Sterling glanced toward Calvin, then back at Elijah. "He's family. My family." Elijah frowned, caught off guard. "Wait, what?" Sterling nodded toward Elijah. "You were the only one who treated him like a person, and because of that, he made it to the hospital in time to see his daughter come out of surgery. You didn't just fix a car. You gave a father a chance to be by his kid's side when it mattered most." Elijah's throat tightened. He hadn't expected this, any of it. He shifted in his seat, eyes flicking between them. "I wasn't trying to make a statement. He needed help. And you gave it," Calvin said simply. "No one else even looked at me. I've seen that before. Lived through it. People don't expect kindness from guys who look like me. But you didn't blink. You just acted." There was a long silence before Sterling spoke again. "Calvin isn't just my brother. He helped me build this company in the early days. Before the suits, before the contracts, he was out there in the cold fixing cars with me long before there were 10 locations and a corporate board. He stepped back years ago, but he still matters to me and to this company. And when I found out how he was treated yesterday, I was furious." Elijah's voice was quiet. "I lost my job over it." Sterling leaned back. "And your manager lost his this morning. Effective immediately. Discrimination, whether racial, social, or simple dismissiveness based on appearance, has no place under this roof." Elijah blinked, stunned. "Wait, seriously?" Calvin smiled for the first time. A small, crooked thing full of grit. "You paid a price for doing the right thing. Time someone else did, too." Sterling stood, walking to a small folder on the desk. "Elijah, I've reviewed your record. Your performance is among the top 5% of every shop we own. You've never had a single formal complaint, and every customer you've touched left happy. That's not common at your age." He slid the folder forward. "We're offering you a promotion, lead technician for this location, pay increase, benefits, a team of your own, and we'll be working with you directly to make sure this shop reflects the values we claim to stand for." Elijah stared at the papers, overwhelmed. The room blurred slightly at the edges. For a moment he couldn't speak. Calvin broke the silence. "My job is driving a cab right now, but it doesn't define who I am. You saw me, the person, not the job or the panic. And today I wanted to make sure you're seen, too." Elijah stood slowly, his voice just above a whisper. "Thank you. I don't even know what to say." Sterling extended a hand. "Say yes." And Elijah did, not with words, but with a grip. Solid, sure, and steady. The kind of grip that said, "I'm here. I'm ready. I belong." As he left the room, the other techs parted to let him through. No one laughed. No one whispered. They looked at him differently now, not because he'd won something, but because he hadn't backed down. Outside, the city had dimmed into twilight. Lights blinked to life across windows like stars waking up early. Elijah stepped onto the sidewalk, leather folder in hand, and exhaled. For the first time, he didn't feel like he was surviving. He felt like he was becoming.